Hello, my name is Masumi Izumi, and I am a historian teaching North American Studies at Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan. It is a great honor to be invited to the 2020 Tadaima a Community Virtual Pilgrimage, and I'm happy to be participating in this in Kyoto. And I really appreciate this opportunity to introduce my book, which came out in the fall last year from the Temple University Press. I have been studying about Japanese American and Japanese Canadian forced removal and incarceration during World War II. I have also looked at community activism during and after the Yellow Power movement and analyzed how cultural activities such as taiko drumming and ethnic festivals helped revive the Japanese North American communities, which simultaneously nurtured political activism that empowered the victims of past racial injustice to come forward and support other communities facing similar kind of oppression. So I would like to pay tribute to those who are resisting state violence today against asylum seekers and immigrants and other oppressed minorities, like Tsuru for Solidarity, organizers and volunteers for these pilgrimage events, and many others who are doing very important work to pass on the stories of JA incarceration to future generations, as well as to other communities. I would also like to acknowledge that I have been receiving a tremendous amount of friendship and love and support from the Japanese North American communities. So I would like to share PowerPoint with you. So today I am hoping to add to the collective knowledge about the JA incarceration by talking about a lesser known aspect of this episode, that the JA incarceration actually helps the rise of the surveillance state in the post-war America as the state apparatus of detention became more sophisticated over the McCarthy period and the civil rights era. So the title of my talk today is Race, Loyalty, and Internal Insecurity, How the Japanese American Incarceration Helped the Rise of a Surveillance State. My book is titled The Rise and Fall of America's Concentration Camp Law, Civil Liberties Debates from the Internment to McCarthyism and the Radical 1960s. And some of you might think, oh my God, she's using the term internment. That's a wrong term. She doesn't know what she's talking about. And to this I say, yes, I have read the JACO handbook and I know the problematics of using this term. But I use it mainly because it is a shorthand for an already very long title of my book. But also, I fear, and this is the point of my talk today, that if we argue that we cannot use internment because Nisei were American citizens and internment means the detention of aliens, it might suggest that detention of Issei, who were legally aliens, was justifiable. Similarly, some of you might think, what does McCarthyism has to do with JA incarceration? Japanese Americans were all loyal and there was no military necessity. But again, if we say that the JA incarceration was unjust because there was no military necessity, then it might imply that such a draconian policy might be justified where there is an actual threat to national security. What I want to point out today is that this emphasis on loyalty and the lack of military necessity might actually legitimize the implementation of more repressive measures by the government at a time of insecurity, despite the acknowledgement of the injustice done to Japanese Americans. Instead of drawing a fixed line between Nisei citizens and Issei aliens, I want to illuminate the precariousness of boundaries between citizens and aliens, because it is this boundary that separates those whose rights are protected by the Constitution and those who are placed outside the constitutional protection of civil liberties. I use discourse analysis to see where the boundary is drawn and and how it moves as the government categorizes different people as detainable at different historical moments, depending on the international relations and domestic situations. I think we can all agree that today we are in the middle of a serious crisis, less perhaps from the virus than from the psychological fear and economic anxiety. And this is a kind of time when the government takes its repressive power to a next level. We have seen it happen in the past, and we are seeing it right now. So we have to watch out, and I think it is helpful to carefully look at history. So what is America's concentration camp law? It is a nickname that was given to the Emergency Detention Act, which was Title II of the Internal Security Act of 1950. The Internal Security Act was an anti-communist legislation that had two titles. Title I, the Subversive Activities Control Act, required communist organizations to register with the Attorney General and and tightened the existing immigration and naturalization laws. Title II, the Emergency Detention Act, was the first law in American history that legalized citizens' preventive detention as an internal security measure. It gave the president power to make a public proclamation of the existence of an internal security emergency in case of war, invasion, or insurrection in aid of a foreign enemy. Upon such a declaration, the Attorney General was authorized to apprehend and detain, quote, each person as to whom there is reasonable ground to believe that such person probably would engage in acts of espionage or sabotage, unquote. As repressive as it appears, Title II was a legal attempt to balance internal security with civil liberties. The law was carefully drafted to enact preventive detention and avoid situations like what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. The arrests were to be made by the Justice Department agencies, and no intervention from the military was authorized. When a detainee felt that his or her detention was unreasonable, he or she could file a complaint to the Detention Review Board. If the review board agreed that the detention was unreasonable, the detainee could receive compensation from the government. So this was considered an improvement over Japanese American incarceration, which was based on the detainee's racial affiliation. So how did the Japanese American incarceration lead to the making of the Emergency Detention Act? And how did this law affect civil liberties of all Americans in the 1950s and 60s? To show the connection, I will first dissect how race affected the shift in the boundary between citizens and aliens when Japanese Americans were incarcerated. So the first section of the talk is Invention of an Enemy Non-Aliens, Japanese American Incarceration during World War II. Soon after Pearl Harbor, Japanese, German, and Italian nationals were designated as enemy aliens. The Western Defense Command issued a curfew order for all enemy aliens, plus Americans of Japanese ancestry. Following the issuance of the Executive Order 9066, the Army ordered only Japanese nationals and Americans of Japanese ancestry to leave the Pacific coast. Not only were they excluded from the coastal areas, but they were incarcerated in inland concentration camps. Let's look at how the boundary was drawn between those who removed from the coast and those who were left alone. Please look at figure 1. The vertical line represents nationality and the horizontal line shows race. In this figure, those who were written in red are the detained people, and those in green are the ones who retained freedom. If the government respected the citizens' constitutionally guaranteed freedom, the incarceration should have been imposed on all enemy aliens, that is, German nationals, Italian nationals, and Japanese nationals. And Nisei, American citizens, should have been left alone. But the government incarcerated Nisei along with Issei and did not mass incarcerate Germans or Italians, whether citizens or aliens. Race, not nationality, became the boundary between those who were protected by the Constitution and those who were not. However, when the government defended its policy in front of the Supreme Court, it had to come up with another rhetoric in order to avoid the policy being stricken down as racist. The government lawyers adopted the concept of loyalty and carefully connected it to the notion of military necessity. The government explained that the military knew that the majority of Japanese Americans, alien or citizen, were loyal, but they said they believed that there were a few but unknown number of disloyal aliens and citizens among the JA population. They could not tell which ones were disloyal because of Japanese Americans' cultural otherness or foreignness within the short period of time required to defend the West Coast. This is how they explained the policy. Hence, the military had to remove all persons of Japanese ancestry first as possibly disloyal people and later sort out the ones that were actually disloyal. A year and a half after the initial relocation order, the government gave a questionnaire to sort out the disloyal from the loyal. People who were found loyal were encouraged to leave the camp and be reintegrated into the society. On the other hand, the government sent those who answered no or neutral to loyalty questionnaire to Tule Lake Segregation Center. This process, the segregation of the disloyal and the integration of the rest, equipped the government with a new boundary between citizens entitled to freedom and those who could be locked up in concentration camps. It was no longer race that differentiated the detainable from the ones who deserved freedom. It was loyalty. Let's look at how this process was consolidated by the Supreme Court. In the ex parte endo decision, the court solely relied on the discourse of loyalty. It contended that Executive Order 9066 only allowed the military to make orders to protect the West Coast from espionage and sabotage, and therefore the War Relocation Authority was not allowed to detain persons whose loyalty had been cleared. So the court redefined what was already a reality, that is, Japanese Americans were already locked up in the camps. While the Endo case freed loyal citizens and aliens from the camps, those labeled disloyal, the ones segregated in Tule Lake, were the evidence that the original incarceration policy was justifiable. And in my book, I talk about the Hirabayashi and Korematsu decisions also, but here I want to keep my explanation simple. While the Endo case is understood favorably because it marked the end of JA incarceration, it was also a sinister decision that opened the gate for a larger scale civil rights violations. Now that the government had the power to incarcerate people on the basis of disloyalty, citizenship rights were no longer inalienable, but the reward granted from the state for being loyal to one's country. So you are free as long as you are loyal to your country. And an abuse was bound to happen when the government or the mainstream society could arbitrarily decide what constitutes loyalty and disloyalty. The government in 1944, at the time of the Korematsu and Endo decisions, was not trying to grant itself this new power to lock more people up, but the government and the court manipulated the rhetoric to justify what the government had already done because Tule Lake already existed. Americans did not intend to weaken the constitutional protection for everyone when they allowed the government to lock up Japanese Americans, who were a tiny, unpopular minority at the beginning of the Pacific War. People in general did not think it would affect them. But in the Cold War period, when the difference between the battlefield and the home front ceased to exist, the hunt for the disloyal would rampage through the entire country. And this was the moment when America's concentration camp law was born. So the second section of the talk is Persecution of Un-Americans, the McCarthy Era. On September 23, 1950, Congress passed the Internal Security Act. It was a legal embodiment of McCarthyism. Conservative politicians aimed to alienate communists and communist sympathizers by forcing them to register with the Attorney General. Communists were in definition disloyal and therefore un-American, and whoever labeled as a communist could be purged from jobs, social organizations, and even social life. Liberal politicians were concerned about this kind of brand and alienate scheme because the purge was mainly targeted at labor organizers, leftist educators and cultural producers, sexual minorities, and civil rights activists. Liberal politicians close to the Truman administration criticized communist registration as thought control because the persecution was based on people's political ideology and not on concrete subversive actions. But they were under pressure to show that they were also tough on communism. To present an alternative measures to control domestic subversive activities, like espionage and sabotage, liberals proposed the Emergency Detention Bill to grant the government adequate power to prevent dangerous activities and preserve freedom of thought at the same time. Thus, Title II legalized preventive detention and authorized internal security agencies such as the FBI to arrest people on warrant when there was reasonable ground to believe that such person probably would engage in acts of espionage or sabotage. The drafters of Title II modeled the law after Japanese American incarceration. It is most likely that the original draft came out of Democratic Senator Paul Douglas's office, and one of the drafters, Joseph L. Rao Jr., was one of the three lawyers who advised Attorney General Francis Biddle confirming the constitutionality of Japanese American mass exclusion in February 1942. They didn't really affirm and confirm the constitutionality, but it in effect affirmed the constitutionality of the incarceration. Rao, like Edward Innes and Francis Biddle, were disturbed by what happened to Japanese Americans during the war and were actively involved in civil liberties politics in the post-war period. Senator Paul Douglas argued in the congressional debate that this bill was a major improvement over Japanese American incarceration because under the new law, the detention, quote, would be carried out not on the basis of race or nationality, but on the basis of demonstrated actions likely to lead to acts of espionage or sabotage, unquote. Senator Douglas referred to the Endo case to argue that Japanese American Supreme Court decisions implied that the government was equipped with power to detain disloyal citizens. Conservatives refuted the idea that the Supreme Court had sanctioned the detention of disloyal citizens. Senator Homer Ferguson, a major supporter of the Communist Registration Bill, correctly pointed out that the Supreme Court decisions in Japanese American cases were limited to narrow grounds. The court only upheld Fred Korematsu's conviction for the violation of the exclusion order, but refused to discuss the constitutionality of the detention order. In Endo, the court ordered Mitsue Endo to be freed, but did not say what should be done about disloyal citizens or aliens. However, because the Supreme Court did not rule on this gray area, the drafters of Title II could use the Japanese American cases to justify their bill. Although Title II was proposed by the liberals as an alternative to Title I, it was eventually added to Title I and became a part of the draconian Internal Security Act over President Truman's veto. The passage of Title II confirmed that American legal system sanctions the detention of citizens on the basis of suspected disloyalty. The government now had the official power to detain anybody by branding the person disloyal because such person was un-American, standing outside the boundary of constitutional protection. It is ironical that it was the liberals who proposed Title II in order to prevent the Communist Registration Bill from passing. Title II was never activated because the president never made the declaration of the existence of an internal security emergency between 1950 and 1971 when the law was repealed. However, 6 potential campsites were designated to incarcerate possible detainees: Florence and Vickensburg, Arizona; Avon Park, Florida; Allenwood, Pennsylvania; El Reno, Oklahoma; and Tule Lake, California. Tule Lake was the former Japanese American Segregation Center, and Florence, Arizona was a city in vicinity of the Gila River War Relocation Center. The camps were never used under Title II, but some of these sites were used as either federal or state prisons or detention centers for undocumented immigrants many years after the passage and even repeal of the law. Even though the Emergency Detention Act was never enforced, it left an ominous legacy in the history of American civil liberties. In order for internal security agencies to immediately arrest and detain potentially disloyal citizens, they had to constantly conduct surveillance over people in peacetime and prepare a list of those who would be detained once an emergency occurs. The FBI grew in budget and the number of personnel during the 1950s and 60s. The FBI had already started surveilling and creating lists of fascists and communists in the 1930s, which included names of many Issei men, and about 4,000 of them were picked up at the beginning of the Pacific War. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, kept working on the list discreetly after the end of World War II. During the congressional debate on the Internal Security Act, Hoover announced that he was keeping track of some 12,000 dangerous persons who he could pick up just like that. He said at one point, there were 55,000 communists in America and 500,000 fellow travelers and sympathizers. The information from the FBI's Internal Security Index, that's the blacklist, was shared with the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or the infamous HUAC, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and state agencies conducting McCarthyist persecutions all over the country. It was an ironical fact that Title II was drafted by liberals who considered Japanese American incarceration racist and unjust. It was even more ironical that by passing Title II, they undermined the concept of civil liberties for everyone. And in fact, Senator Paul Douglas, one of the main drafters of the bill, was himself on the FBI's blacklist of people to be detained once the internal security emergency was declared. Beginning in 1956, the FBI expanded its activities further, moving from purely investigatory activities to more aggressive counterintelligence programs, or COINTELPRO. Recent studies have elucidated how the Cold War politics advanced racial liberalism in the late 1940s and 50s. But we cannot forget that this happened at the expense of civil liberties in a larger sense, on the threshold of a rapid expansion of state apparatus for surveillance and detention. So the third section I'm not really going to talk about is the repeal of Title II and the passage of the Non-Detention Act. So I briefly summarize. The last two chapters of my book explain the repeal of Title II in the context of radical social change in the late 1960s. I document how Edison Uno and Raymond Okamura initiated the Title II repeal campaign, creating an ad hoc committee within the JACL in 1967. The repeal campaign was a precursor to the redress movement, as it set the stage for Japanese Americans to speak in public about their wartime incarceration experiences and connected Japanese Americans scattered across the country. Title II repeal campaign was also important because it helped Japanese Americans to share the memories of their oppression with other minorities that were also concerned about the reusage of concentration camps. 1971 not only saw the repeal of Title II, but the passage of the Non-Detention Act, which prohibited the construction of concentration camps in America. So I don't have time to talk about the repeal campaign in details today, but you can read my book, and also I would be very happy to talk about it if I get invited to speak at another future events like this. So in conclusion, in this talk, I considered Japanese American incarceration and its legacies in the post-war civil liberties in the context of national and internal security and insecurity. I elucidated how race allowed the violation of civil liberties based on suspected disloyalty at the beginning of the Pacific War, and that led to making a huge hole in the Constitution, which would lead to a massive scale civil liberties restriction in the McCarthy era. Race functioned as a threshold, but if Japanese American history only considered this event in the light of race, we miss the impact it had on general American civil liberties after Japanese Americans were accepted into the larger society. I also want to caution about overemphasizing Japanese Americans' loyalty and silencing the experience of those who were labeled disloyal. Mass incarceration of an ethnic group is unjustifiable whether or not there are a few individuals who commit espionage among its members, because there is no reason for the entire group to bear collective responsibility for individual deeds. As we have seen, loyalty is an ambiguous term whose content can be arbitrarily defined by governmental agencies such as the WRA or surveilling officers and agents like the FBI. The tragedy of Tule Lake illuminates impossibility and thus violence of forcing a binary choice on transnational subjects, because there are many shades of gray between someone's loyalty and disloyalty to one's nation or another. We need to remember that disloyalty never had legal ground for excluding someone from constitutional protection. But it all happened at the discursive level. And 75 years later, it looks like the Japanese American community is still struggling to break free from the spell. As we witness widespread protests across the United States and tense interactions between unarmed citizens and the armed federal troops and state law enforcement officers, the story of JA incarceration needs to be told not only in the light of past racial injustice, but also in the light of national and internal security and insecurity. The story is relevant to all Americans as the nation faces a crisis, and many of its citizens are protesting inequality and repression of dissent. Thank you very much. Thank you.